Hey guys, you have no idea how much I miss you. I can't wait till we can hopefully get back to school. I don't know when that's going to be, but I know that I want it. I hope you do too because you all are such an amazing group of kiddos, and I wanted to be able to spend the last few months with you, and we had so many fun things planned. One thing that I do always do with my students, probably for the past 4 years, I guess, is we do a novel study of this story. Make sure it's not shiny. It's called Hachiko Waits, and the author is Leslea Newman. And this is the most amazing true story. It took place in Japan in the early 1900s, and there's actually a movie available with that goes along with this book, but the only difference is it's kind of Americanized, and what I mean by that is the actual story took place in Japan, but the movie I think they made it in Pennsylvania, and it stars Richard Gere, and it's actually a wonderful story. But it's just called Hachi, I believe, A Dog's Tale. I think that's what it's called, and it used to be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it still is or not. What we normally do is we read the story. It usually takes us a few weeks. We read the story, and then we do several things that goes along with it. And you'll be doing anything that I will have you do with this. I will upload onto Google Classroom. And so as of right now, I have 12 students on there. I'd really love to have all 20 of you. That would be awesome. But I understand some of you, you might even be watching this on a parent's phone. You may not actually have a way to do some of the activities, and I understand that. But for those of you that can, I'd really love for you to, because I want us to be able to interact. And this is pretty much kind of the way it's going to be, at least for now. And but we do several of the activities that we'll do are basically, there's vocabulary words that are connected with this story. I actually made up a spelling word list, and it's the same one I've done for the past 4 years. They are a little bit more challenging than what you're used to, but I know you'll be able to do it just fine. I'm not even remotely concerned. And just do your best. That's all I ask, guys. This is a really strange situation that we found ourselves in, and I don't think any of us ever expected this to happen. And I just want you to know that I love you, and I hope you're safe. I hope your families are safe. And from everybody that I've talked to so far, I think all of you are doing well, and that's wonderful news. My family and I were doing well, as well as all of my pets, which some of your parents are friends with me on Facebook, and so they see the pictures that I put up. And that's usually all I ever do when I put anything up on Facebook anyway. It's usually just fun little animal pictures, or even stuff that I do in my classroom, because I love being a teacher and I love you guys. Okay, so to go ahead and get us started, we are going to, I'm probably just going to do about 2 chapters a day. There may be 1 or 2 days that I don't read from it, and I will just put up an assignment for you to do, and I will let you know if I'm going to do that or not. Usually while I'm reading it, I will let you know whether or not, okay, we're going to stop right here for today, and we'll pick this up, 2 days from now. I try and do two chapters a day, though, because I try and stretch it to be about a 2-week novel study is usually what we do. And there are going to be, like I said, activities to go along with this, so I feel like I'm repeating myself. So anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if you all look, I know many of you are dog lovers like myself, and can any of you guess what breed this is? Anyone? This is an Akita. They are incredibly loyal. They pretty much, from what I've read, and this story is very indicative of it, is that they are very much kind of a one-person dog. I mean, they'll be friendly with other people, but they usually bond with like one person. And that's who that's basically their partner in crime, so to speak. And in this story is definitely true to that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So once again, Hachiko Waits by Leslea Newman. Okay. I hope you guys love this story. This is honestly one of my favorite stories that we do every year, because then we watch the movie afterwards, and then we do kind of a compare and contrast, and my kids always love it every year, so I hope you do too. Okay. Chapter 1. When Professor Elisabero Ueno woke up, he liked to play a game with his golden brown puppy, Hachi. He lay on his futon, not moving a muscle. He didn't even open his eyes. Could he fool Hachi into thinking he was asleep? Not a chance. Hachi knew the instant his master was awake, and told him so by pushing his cold, wet nose into the professor's hand. Good morning, Hachi. The professor sat up and rubbed the soft patch of white fur that ran from the puppy's nose up between his eyes and stopped just below his pointy ears. Did you sleep well, little friend? Hachi answered by wagging his fluffy curled tail back and forth with great enthusiasm. I'm glad you had such a fine night, the professor said as he put on his glasses and rose from his silk sleeping mat. Now come along, Hachi. Let's start the day. He motioned to the puppy. He followed along as the professor washed himself, put on a dark blue kimono, and headed downstairs to eat the breakfast his housekeeper had prepared for him before she left for the marketplace. As you all can probably already tell, and I had already told you this takes place in Japan, and there's several things that the Japanese do that are very different than the way we do. I mean, as you can see, I'm in like a tall bed. They actually sleep in these little sleeping mats. They're like very close to the floor. Their tables are even, I had an aunt and uncle that actually lived in Japan for about 3 years, and they told me about all the customs. They lived in a place called Nagasaki. And as you get into history later on in your school, you will find out about the atomic bomb and what happened in Nagasaki and the wars and everything. But it's very it's something for an older age. Let's just put it that way. But anyway, and you'll notice, and they said he put on a dark blue kimono. And if any of you have ever watched anything, and I know there's a lot of like Japanese cartoons and stuff that some of you have probably seen, and they will even look at those anime cartoons that I know a lot of you like, Pokemon, any of those type of things. They're Japanese, and they have a very distinct style in the way that they do things, and you'll definitely feel that even though this story is an older story, it still reigns true. Okay, the professor entered the tatami room, walked across the straw mats covering the floor, and sat down on a cushion in front of a low wooden table. He poured himself a cup of hot green tea. As he lifted the steaming teacup, he looked up at a calendar hanging on the wall. The page it was turned to had a beautiful picture of a bright yellow sun rising over Japan. April 1st, 1924, the professor read out loud. It is going to be a good day, little friend. The professor said this every day. He was a man of habit. Professor Ueno began to eat his breakfast of miso soup, dried fish and seaweed, rice, cooked eggs, and pickled radishes. His housekeeper also had set out breakfast for Hachi, a bowl of rice with miso soup poured over it. Hachi went over to his bowl, sniffed at it once, and walked away. He sat in the doorway and gazed at his master with a pleading look in his dark brown eyes. The professor knew what Hachi wanted, but he shook his head. No, Hachi, you cannot have yakitori for breakfast. He said, yakitori was the puppy's favorite meal. I will buy some for your supper tonight on my way home from the train station, and you can practice pulling the chicken off the skewers the way I taught you. Now eat your food. Hachi stayed where he was, and again the professor knew what he wanted. Hachi played this game with him every morning. He was a dog of habit. All right, Hachi, Professor Ueno went to the dog's bowl and knelt beside it. The professor smacked his lips as he pretended to pick up a bit of his food out of the bowl and taste it. What delicious rice this is, Hachi. Come and try a bite here. He scooped up a tiny bit of rice with his index finger and held it out to Hachi. The dog licked his finger and began to eat. Did you enjoy your breakfast this morning? The professor asked when Hachi was done. Hachi looked at him with 2 grains of rice stuck in his wet black nose. The professor laughed. Let me wash your face, little friend. You cannot go around looking like that. He tenderly wiped the dog's muzzle with the corner of his napkin. What a handsome dog you are. Hachi sat up tall and straight, basking in his master's praise. Here is an illustration that was drawn. The illustrator is Makio Kadara. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Obviously a Japanese illustrator, beautiful illustration. This entire novel has, I mean, it's not like every page because it is a novel. It's not a comic strip. It's not a graphic novel. It's a regular book. So there's only going to be a few illustrations, but as you can see, they're beautifully done. Beautifully done. The professor finished his tea and rose from his cushion. Now it is time for your lesson, Hachi. Come. Professor Ueno walked to the front entryway with Hachi at his heels. The ginkan had a mat spread out along one wall with several pairs of the professor's shoes lined up neatly upon it. The professor stepped out of his house slippers and into a pair of geta, the wooden clogs he wore outside. Then together, he and Hachi walked out of the house, across the front porch and into the yard. Look, Hachi, the professor pointed to a tree in the yard that was full of pink buds about to bloom. Soon it will be time for our cherry blossom party. He took a few deep breaths, filling his lungs with fresh spring air, then turned to face his dog. Let us begin, he said to the puppy. Hachi, sit. The professor gave the command in a serious tone of voice, and Hachi immediately sat. Good dog, said the professor. Hachi, down. Hachi lowered his body onto the ground, and again his master complimented him. What a good dog you are. The professor knelt down and rubbed the fur around Hachi's neck and shoulders. What a smart dog you are, Hachi. What a clever dog you are. Professor Ueno praised Hachi in a high-pitched voice as though he were talking to a baby. We will try 2 more things. The professor stood up and lowered his voice. Hachi, heel. The Professor Ueno took a few steps around the garden, and Hachi followed him, keeping close to his left side. Good dog, Hachi. Sit. Hachi did as he was told. Now, Hachi, speak, said the professor. Hachi stared at him silently, his head tilted to one side. Hachi, speak. The professor repeated the command, but Hachi remained silent. 1-1, 1-1. Professor Ueno demonstrated for him, yipping like a young puppy. But Hachi did not respond. The professor changed his bark. 1-1, 1-1. He repeated in the deep, growling voice of a large, angry dog. Hachi just looked at him. If you're wondering what 1-1 is, that's basically like when we say a dog bark, bark. It's kind of the Japanese version of it. All right, the professor shook his head. It seems you have nothing to say today, and it is time for me to go teach my other students. Come inside. Professor Ueno changed into a suit and tie and gathered his books and papers together. Then he walked down the hallway to the gunkan and put on a pair of leather shoes. He left the house, and Hachi followed him to the front gate. Hachi, sit, the professor said. What a good dog you are. He bent down until he was almost nose to nose with the puppy. What a fine dog you are, he said softly. Hachi, you are the best dog in all of Japan. He gave Hachi a few soft pats on the head, kissed the tip of his nose, and stood up. I will return at 3 o'clock. Farewell, little friend. The professor turned from Hachi and pulled open the latch. As he went to shut the gate, one of his books dropped to the ground. When the professor bent to pick it up, his glasses slipped down his nose and some papers flew out of his arms. The wind blew them down the street, and he raced after them without closing the gate properly. Hachi nosed it up and ran to be with his master. Hachi, how did you get out? The professor asked. You must go home now. The professor pointed toward the gate and spoke in a stern voice, but Hachi did not move. The professor took a step backward toward the house, but Hachi did not follow. He sat down right where he was and stared at the professor. Professor Ueno sighed and looked at his watch. Hachi, I'm going to miss my train, he said. Hachi wagged his tail. The professor sighed again and shook his head. He could never stay mad at his puppy for long. All right, little friend, he said, giving in. Come on, heel. Overjoyed, Hachi spun around in a circle and then fell into step beside his master. Chapter 2. Shibaya was filled with tiled roof houses bordered by a river and surrounded by large fields. The professor and Hachi rounded a corner and made their way down a residential street lined with tall kiyaki trees, their branches covered with clusters of small yellow blossoms. As they walked along, the road grew wider, and a tall Shinto shrine with red wooden gates and a green wolf. Sorry, we're reading about dogs. A green roof came into view. Many people nodded good morning to the professor as he passed, and they admired Hachi, who pranced along beside his master. His pointed ears pitched forward, his curled tail held high. As the professor and Hachi neared the train station, the streets grew busier, with people rushing along on foot and bicycle. Merchants in dark blue hoppy jackets scurried by, pulling large two-wheeled wooden carts stacked high with boxes. Hachi, sit, the professor said as he stopped at a corner and waited for a green trolley to pass. Then they crossed the street to the stairway leading up to the train station. Hachi lifted his nose and sniffed the air around the foot stalls near the steps to the station. Each stall was decorated with brightly colored paper lanterns, and each sold different things to eat: noodles, tofu, egg and fish, boiled in broth, and yakitori. The vendors did not open until later in the day, the professor told Hachi. And you have already had your breakfast, little friend. Come. He hurried up the steps to the train station, and Hachi hurried beside him. Good morning, Professor Ueno. The professor turned around and saw the station master dressed in a crisp black uniform, white gloves, and red brimmed hat, bowing in respect. Good morning, Mr. Yoshikawa. What a fine-looking dog you have there, the station master said. Hachi sat down and puffed out his chest proudly, as though he understood Mr. Yoshikawa's compliment. I do not know what to do with them, said the professor, reaching down to rest his hand on the back of Hachi's head. He followed me here, and I was afraid I would miss my train if I took him back home. I will watch him for you, Mr. Yoshikawa said with another bow. I would be happy to do you the favor. I could not ask you to do such a thing, said the professor. Ah, but you did not ask, the station master pointed out. I offered. I will keep him in my office. It is too much trouble. It is no trouble at all, Mr. Yoshikawa insisted. On the contrary, it would be an honor for me to do such a small thing for a man of your position. The professor nodded as he thought over the station master's offer. Arigato, Mr. Oshikawa, he said, bowing in thanks. That is very kind of you. I will return at 3 o'clock. We will be waiting for you, said Mr. Yoshikawa, bowing as well. What is your dog's name? His name is Hachi. Hachi? Why did you name him 8? 8 is my lucky number because the kanji for 8 is shaped like a fan held upside down. It is wider at the bottom than at the top. The professor explained using his finger to draw the shape of the Japanese character in the air. That means that the future is wide open, and Hachi is the 8th dog I have owned, so he is sure to be lucky. He is smarter than any other dog I have trained. Already I have taught him to sit, to lie down, to come, and to heel. The only thing I cannot teach him is to bark. Perhaps it is better that he does not speak, remarked the station master. Some dogs cannot be taught to stop barking. That is true, said the professor, but Akitas do not misbehave like that. They do not bark unless they think something is wrong, but I would still like to teach him, just to hear the sound of his voice. He looked down at the puppy, but Hachi remained silent. Ah, well, Professor Ueno said, I am sure Hachi will speak to me when he has something important to say. Thank you again for offering to watch him. The professor bowed to the station master. He will listen to you. He looked down at his puppy once more, a very good dog. The professor showed the ticket taker his train pass and walked with Hachi and the station master onto a platform that bordered the train tracks and was sheltered by a red roof. The platform was crowded with commuters and shoppers. Many of the men wore business suits and leather shoes, as the professor did, but some of the men and most of the women wore kimonos and wooden gaita clogs or straw zori sandals on their feet. While the station master patrolled the platform, Professor Ueno stood beside a woman in a green cotton kimono patterned with butterflies fastened at her waist with an obi the color of pale jade. Her belongings were all tied up in a green cloth furishiki. She balanced the tidy bundle on her right palm. With her other hand, she smoothed her small son's sailor suit. When at last the woman was satisfied with the boy's school uniform, she brushed some wisps of hair away from his forehead with her fingertips. Look, Oki-san. The boy broke from his mother's fussing and pointed. A dog is waiting for the train. He held his hand out toward Hachi, but his mother pulled it back. Yasuo, be careful. He might bite. He will not hurt you. The professor knelt down between the boy and Hachi. He is very gentle. What is his name? Asked the boy. His name is Hachi, answered the professor as he stood up. And I am Aizaburo Ueno. I am Mrs. Takahashi, said Yasuo's mother, bowing her head. And this is Yasuo, my son. Yasuo is very curious. As if to prove his mother's point, Yasuo bowed and immediately posed another question. What kind of dog is Hachi? He asked the professor. Yasuo, Mrs. Takahashi said. Do not be such a bother. Here's a beautiful little illustration. So there's Professor Ueno, Hachi, Yasuo, and his mom. I love the illustrations in this book. I think they're wonderful. Excuse me, I keep making a lot of grammar errors as I'm reading. I think I get caught up in the story and I get ahead of myself. I do that a lot because I know what's going to happen, which isn't probably the best. But it's okay. It is no bother, said the professor. I am happy to answer your question. Hachi is a very special dog called an Akita-kun, he said proudly. And then, being a professor, he could not stop himself from giving Yasuo, his mother, a short lesson about the breed. Akitas are known for their intelligence, loyalty, and extreme devotion. Many years ago, when Akitas were first bred in the northern mountains of Honshu, only members of the imperial family were permitted to own them. The breed is more than 300 years old. How old is Hachi? Yasuo asked. Oh, he is just a puppy. He is only 6 months old. I am much older than that, Yasuo boasted. He opened his hand, spread his fingers wide, and counted. Ichi. He pulled his thumb into his palm. Ni. He folded down his index finger. San, chi, go. Yasuo bent in the rest of his fingers and held up the closed fist with pride. I am 5 years old, he said, almost 6, and today is my first day of school. I am going to school too, said the professor. Yasuo looked at him in surprise. I thought grown-ups went to work, he said. I work at a school, the professor explained. I am a teacher in the agricultural department of Tokyo Imperial University. When you are older, maybe you will be in my class. I would like that, said Yasuo. At exactly 9 o'clock, the train appeared around the bend of the tracks, squealed into the station on squeaky brakes, and came to a halt. As the commuters rushed onto the train station filled with noise of dozens of pairs of wooden geta clogs clacking against the platform. The professor stood still while everyone else hurried past him onto the train. Hachi, sit, he said. Hachi sat, and Professor Ueno bent down and looked into his dark brown eyes. What a good dog you are, the professor said once the station had quieted. What a fine dog you are, he repeated softly. Hachi, you are the best dog in all of Japan. He stroked Hachi's head, kissed the tip of his nose, and straightened up. I will return at 3 o'clock. The professor stepped inside the train just before it pulled away and waved to Hachi. Farewell, little friend. Hachi stayed right where he was on the platform, craning his neck to watch the departing train that held his master. When he could no longer see it, he sat a few minutes more, staring at the empty tracks. Mr. Yoshikawa came up behind him and scratched his ears. You are going to spend the day with me, Hachi, he said. Come. Mr. Yoshikawa took a few steps back toward the office, but Hachi remained where he was, staring off in the direction the professor's train had gone. Then he stood up, turned, and trotted toward the exit of the station. Hachi, Mr. Yoshikawa called, clapping his white glove sharply. Come back. Hachi ignored him and continued on his way. Hachi, the station master cried. He hurried after the dog, but when Hachi saw he was being chased, he dashed through the station, down the steps, and out onto the street. Mr. Yoshikawa followed the dog down the stairs and tried to catch him, but he could not leave his post at the train station. In the dismay, he watched as the tip of Hachi's tail disappeared around a corner. What was he going to tell the professor when he returned on the 3 o'clock train? That's the end of chapter 2. As you can see, chapter 3 is our next chapter. We're going to go ahead and stop there for today. I really hope you stay for reading of the entire novel. Like I said, it'll probably, I try and stretch it almost 2 weeks. I know I made some reading errors while I was reading. I get really excited with this book, and so I get ahead of myself and I make errors. I'm not paying attention. So, but guys, I missed you so much. You can, if you have any questions or want to say any comments, you can, in the description box down below, in the little comment description box, you can put comments and I can read them, as well as your fellow classmates. I'm sure you'd like to speak with each other. I think that's great. I know that you miss each other, and I don't think you miss each other as much as I miss you, though. I love you guys, and so I will see you tomorrow, or you will see me tomorrow, actually. Bye-bye.